The autumn sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as hundreds of protesters gathered for what began as a peaceful demonstration. The crowd's diverse faces reflected the community's makeup, their signs swaying gently in the breeze. Among them, Judge Samuel Johnson made his way through the crowd, his pressed suit and dignified bearing marking him as someone of importance, though he carried himself with humility. The cardboard sign in his hands read, "Justice knows no color," its simple message reflecting years of careful thought and personal pain. Fellow protesters nodded respectfully as he joined their ranks, though few recognized him as a federal judge. He preferred it that way. Today, he was simply another voice calling for change. Several yards away, Officer Tom Brady stood rigid at his assigned position, his jaw clenched tight enough to cause pain. His eyes darted from face to face in the crowd, his fingers drumming a nervous pattern against his leg. The chrome of his badge caught the sunlight as his chest rose and fell with increasingly rapid breaths. To him, each chant from the crowd felt like a personal attack, each sign an accusation. The demonstration had been building steadily throughout the morning. Church groups stood alongside student activists, their voices joining in calls for police reform. The atmosphere remained charged, but controlled, with organizers moving through the crowd, ensuring everyone maintained the peaceful nature of the protest. Tom's radio crackled with routine check-ins from other officers positioned around the courthouse. Each time he responded, his voice grew tighter, more strained. His fellow officers noticed his increasing agitation, but said nothing, attributing it to the general tension of the day. As the crowd's energy swelled, their chants grew louder. "No justice, no peace, reform the police." The words echoed off the courthouse walls, creating a symphony of voices that seemed to press in from all sides. Samuel found himself near the front of the gathering, his sign held high above his head as he joined in the chants. The breaking point came suddenly. A group of younger protesters began a new chant, their voices rising above the others. "Who do you protect? Who do you serve?" Something in Tom snapped, his face contorted with rage as he broke formation, shoving his way through the crowd toward the source of the chants. Samuel, seeing the officers advance, stepped forward instinctively, perhaps hoping to de-escalate the situation. In that crucial moment, his judicial robes were absent, his federal badge hidden in his pocket. He was simply a black man standing between an angry officer and the crowd. Tom's attack was swift and brutal. His baton connected with savage force, sending Samuel sprawling onto the concrete steps. As he fell, the impact dislodged his identification, the federal judge's badge skittering across the pavement like a dropped coin. The crowd fell silent for one terrible moment before erupting in horrified shouts. The scene froze in a tableau of horror, Samuel lying stunned on the ground, his sign crumpled beneath him, Tom standing over him, baton still raised, and the judge's badge catching the sunlight between them, its golden surface reflecting the sky above. In the seconds that followed, dozens of cell phones rose to capture the moment, their lenses recording the instant when one man's rage collided with another's dignity, setting in motion events that would reshape both their lives. Within hours of the incident, smartphone footage of Tom's assault on Samuel flooded social media platforms. The videos spread like wildfire, each showing the attack from different angles, leaving no room for misinterpretation. The most damning footage captured the exact moment when Samuel's federal judge credentials became visible, transforming what might have been seen as just another incident into a national scandal. News networks picked up the story by nightfall. Their chyrons blared headlines like "Federal Judge Assaulted at Police Reform Protest" and "Officer Attacks Federal Judge During Peaceful Demonstration." Security camera footage from the courthouse, released by authorities under intense public pressure, provided an even clearer view of the unprovoked attack. Social media metrics showed the videos being shared millions of times, with public figures and celebrities amplifying the message. In the sterile quiet of the hospital's private room, Samuel Johnson lay in his bed, the harsh fluorescent lights highlighting the bruising on his face. Medical monitors beeped steadily beside him as doctors diagnosed a concussion, 3 cracked ribs, and extensive bruising. His daughter Sarah sat beside him, her hands trembling as she adjusted his pillows for the 100th time. "Dad," Sarah whispered, her voice catching. "This is exactly what happened to Marcus." The weight of her words hung heavy in the room. Marcus, her brother, had died during a police encounter 3 years earlier. Samuel reached for her hand, wincing at the movement. The parallel wasn't lost on him. The same system that had taken his son had now turned its violence on him. Outside the hospital, reporters gathered in growing numbers. Their presence created an impromptu media village, complete with satellite trucks and camera crews. Hospital security had to establish a perimeter to maintain order as supporters began arriving, holding candlelight vigils that would continue through the night. Social media platforms erupted with hashtags, "Justice for Judge Johnson" and "Police Reform" now began trending nationally. Activist groups seized the moment, organizing protests in major cities across the country. The image of a federal judge, a pillar of the justice system, being struck down became a powerful symbol that transcended typical political divisions. Sarah's phone buzzed constantly with messages of support and media requests. She fielded calls from civil rights leaders, politicians, and fellow activists, all wanting to speak with her father. Through it all, Samuel remained thoughtful, even as pain medication clouded his thoughts. He recognized that this moment, however painful, presented an opportunity for real change. "We need to be strategic," he told Sarah, his judicial mind already working through the implications. "This isn't just about me anymore." He thought about all the cases he'd presided over, all the times he'd heard testimony about police misconduct. Now, he had become part of the story he'd spent his career trying to address from the bench. The hospital television showed endless coverage of protests erupting in cities nationwide. In New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and dozens of other cities, people took to the streets. The movement that had been building for years found new momentum in this latest example of police brutality, one that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. As night fell, Samuel watched the coverage with growing resolve. Despite his injuries, despite the fear in his daughter's eyes, he knew he had to transform this moment of personal trauma into something meaningful. The system he'd served faithfully for decades had revealed its flaws in the most personal way possible. Now, he had a platform and a responsibility to speak out. 1 week after the incident, Samuel Johnson sat in a community center conference room, his ribs still bandaged beneath his suit. Around the table sat a diverse group of community leaders, religious figures, civil rights attorneys, grassroots organizers, and reformed police officers. The meeting had been carefully organized, each participant chosen for their experience and commitment to meaningful change. "We need to move beyond anger," Samuel stated, his voice still carrying the authority of the bench despite his injuries. "Rage is justified, but it won't build the bridges we need." He spread out various documents on the table, statistics on police brutality, draft legislation proposals, and training reform recommendations. The group began methodically working through each item, developing a comprehensive strategy for reform. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Tom Brady sat alone in an internal affairs interview room. The stark fluorescent lights emphasized the dark circles under his eyes, evidence of sleepless nights since the incident. The department had placed him on immediate administrative leave, his badge and gun surrendered. As investigators questioned him about his actions, Tom's usual defensive posture began to crack. "Tell us about your childhood in South Boston," the investigator prompted, having discovered concerning patterns in Tom's background. The question triggered a flood of memories: his father's drunken racist rants, the neighborhood's tribal mentality, the unspoken rules about who belonged and who didn't. Tom found himself speaking about things he'd never addressed in his 15 years on the force. The investigation uncovered a history of complaints against Tom, mostly dismissed or buried in bureaucratic procedures. Each incident revealed a pattern of targeting minorities, though none had been as dramatic as the assault on Judge Johnson. The department's internal review process itself came under scrutiny, exposing systemic failures in officer accountability. Back at the community center, Samuel's coalition began taking shape. They organized working groups focused on specific areas: legislative reform, community outreach, police training overhaul, and victim support services. Samuel's legal expertise proved invaluable in crafting proposals that could withstand legislative and judicial scrutiny. "We need to understand the root causes," Samuel explained during a particularly intense discussion. "This isn't just about individual officers. It's about a culture that enables and protects them." His words carried extra weight now, coming from someone who had experienced both sides of the system, as a judge and as a victim. The media remained hungry for updates. Samuel's team strategically managed his public appearances, knowing each statement would be scrutinized. They scheduled a press conference that would serve as their public launch, carefully timing it to maximize impact and media coverage. Tom's therapy sessions, mandated by the department, began revealing deeper issues. His therapist, Dr. Martinez, specialized in helping law enforcement officers confront their biases. Together, they started unpacking years of ingrained prejudices, defensive mechanisms, and unexamined beliefs. The process was painful, forcing Tom to confront uncomfortable truths about himself and his chosen profession. As preparations for the press conference continued, threats began arriving at Samuel's office. Anonymous calls, hateful emails, and social media messages demonstrated the opposition they faced. Yet each threat only strengthened Samuel's resolve. He had spent his career believing in the power of the law to effect change. Now, he would test that belief in the most personal way possible. The city convention center buzzed with anticipation as thousands gathered for what would become a defining moment in the movement. Samuel Johnson stood backstage, reviewing his speech notes one final time. The venue's massive screens displayed statistics, victim photos, and proposed reform measures. Among them was a photo of his son Marcus, a reminder of why this fight mattered. "We gather today not just as protesters, but as architects of change," Samuel began, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. His speech, carefully crafted over sleepless nights, wove together personal experience with judicial insight. He spoke about the dual nature of law enforcement, its necessity and its flaws, drawing from his years on the bench. The cameras caught every word, broadcasting live across major networks. "When I was struck down on those courthouse steps, I felt the same helplessness my son felt in his final moments," Samuel continued, his voice steady despite the emotion. "But I also saw something he didn't live to see, the possibility of real change." He outlined specific reforms: independent oversight boards, mandatory de-escalation training, community involvement in police recruitment, and transparent disciplinary procedures. Across town, Tom Brady sat in his darkened living room, watching the speech on his television. Empty coffee cups and takeout containers evidenced his isolation since the incident. The judge's words hit him with unexpected force, especially when Samuel described his son's death. Tom found himself remembering similar incidents he'd witnessed or participated in throughout his career, moments he'd previously justified or ignored. Political figures began responding to Samuel's speech in real time. Some pledged support, others defended the status quo, but none could ignore the movement's growing momentum. Social media exploded with reactions, hashtags trending nationwide as people shared their own stories of police encounters. "This isn't about destroying law enforcement," Samuel emphasized, addressing concerns head-on. "It's about rebuilding it to serve everyone equally." He introduced a panel of reform-minded police officers who supported the changes, demonstrating that the movement included voices from within law enforcement itself. Tom watched these officers speak, their words challenging his long-held beliefs about police solidarity. Their testimonies about witnessing and reporting misconduct resonated with experiences he'd pushed aside. His hand shook as he reached for his phone, opening photos from his early days on the force. A younger, idealistic version of himself who'd wanted to protect and serve. The speech culminated with Samuel's announcement that he'd been invited to testify before Congress. The crowd erupted in cheers, but Samuel remained focused on the larger goal. "This invitation isn't just for me," he declared. "It's for every victim who never got their day in court, every voice that was silenced, every life cut short." As the event concluded, news analysts began dissecting its implications. Political commentators debated the feasibility of the proposed reforms, while civil rights leaders celebrated the momentum. Samuel's measured approach and legal expertise made it harder for opponents to dismiss the movement as radical or uninformed. Tom turned off his television and sat in darkness, his worldview crumbling around him. The certainties that had guided his career, the thin blue line, us versus them mentality, no longer seemed to hold up against the reality Samuel had presented. His upcoming congressional testimony loomed like a watershed moment, one that would force everyone, including Tom, to choose which side of history they'd occupy. The marble halls of Congress echoed with footsteps as Samuel Johnson made his way to the hearing room. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on his shoulders. Today's testimony could influence police reform legislation across the nation. Television cameras tracked his progress, broadcasting live to millions of viewers who had become invested in his story. Inside the packed hearing room, Samuel took his seat at the witness table. Family members of police brutality victims filled the gallery behind him, including his daughter Sarah, who clutched a photo of her brother Marcus. The committee members arranged themselves on their elevated platform, their expressions ranging from supportive to openly hostile. Judge Johnson, the committee chair began. "Please share with us your unique perspective, both as a federal judge and as a victim of police violence." Samuel leaned toward the microphone, his voice steady as he began the testimony he'd prepared for weeks. "I appear before you today wearing multiple badges of identity," he began. "I am a federal judge who has upheld our laws for 2 decades. I am a father who lost his son to police violence. And now, I am a victim who refuses to be silenced." He proceeded to detail not just his own assault, but the systemic issues he'd observed from the bench, patterns of behavior that repeated across countless cases. Meanwhile, Tom Brady sat in his therapist's office, watching the live broadcast on a tablet. Dr. Martinez observed his reactions carefully as Samuel described the psychological impact of police brutality on communities of color. Tom's hands clenched and unclenched as he listened to testimony that challenged everything he'd been taught to believe. "What's going through your mind right now, Tom?" Dr. Martinez asked quietly. Tom struggled to find words for the confusion and shame churning inside him. Their sessions had been peeling back layers of inherited prejudice, revealing the scared child who'd learned to hate because hate felt like power. Back in the hearing room, Samuel shared concrete examples of successful police reforms from various jurisdictions. He presented data showing reduced violence, improved community relations, and better outcomes for both citizens and officers. His judicial experience lent credibility to his proposals, making it harder for opponents to dismiss them as impractical. The questioning began, with some committee members trying to undermine his credibility, while others sought to strengthen his points. Samuel remained composed, drawing on years of courtroom experience to maintain his dignity under pressure. When one congressman suggested he was being too emotional about police reform, Samuel's response became instantly quotable. "If watching your child die doesn't deserve emotion, sir, what does?" In the therapist's office, Tom began to speak about his own father, a man who'd taught him that strength meant dominance and that difference meant danger. Dr. Martinez guided him through the painful recognition of how these learned behaviors had shaped his career choices and actions. For the first time, Tom began to see his assault on Samuel not as a moment of weakness, but as the inevitable result of years of unchecked prejudice. As the hearing concluded, Samuel made a final appeal that silenced the room. "We're not asking to defund or destroy. We're asking to rebuild and restore. Every officer who abuses power makes it harder for good officers to do their jobs. Every victim who loses faith in justice weakens the system for everyone. We can do better. We must do better." The momentum from Samuel's congressional testimony translated into tangible action. State legislators began introducing reform bills incorporating his recommendations. Police departments across the country faced increasing pressure to implement new training protocols and accountability measures. In meeting rooms and city halls, Samuel's name became synonymous with the possibility of meaningful change. Yet opposition remained fierce. Police unions mobilized their considerable resources to fight the proposed reforms. Conservative media outlets painted Samuel as an activist judge, pushing a radical agenda. Each small victory came at the cost of intense political battles and exhausting negotiations. "We've got support from 3 key senators," an aide reported during a strategy session in Samuel's office. Maps covered the walls, tracking reform initiatives across different states. Some showed promising progress: cities implementing civilian oversight boards, departments revising use of force policies. Others revealed stubborn resistance to change. Meanwhile, Tom Brady found himself drawn back to his childhood neighborhood in South Boston. The familiar streets felt smaller now, the memories sharper and more painful. He parked his car outside his old house, now shabby and worn, much like the beliefs he'd carried from this place. Mrs. O'Malley, his elderly neighbor from childhood, recognized him instantly. "Tommy Brady," she called out, her voice carrying the weight of decades. "I remember when you and your daddy used to give those colored folks such a hard time." Her casual use of the dated term made Tom flinch. "You were such an angry boy after your mama left." The conversation forced Tom to confront memories he'd buried. His father's drunken raids on minority families moving into the neighborhood, the slurs that peppered everyday conversation, the twisted pride in maintaining what they called neighborhood integrity. He remembered participating, first as a child seeking approval, then as a teenager believing he was protecting his community. Back at his office, Samuel reviewed threatening letters that had become a daily occurrence. Private security now accompanied him to public appearances. Sarah begged him to be careful, the fear of losing another family member evident in her eyes. But Samuel refused to back down. "Each threat proves why this work matters," he told his team during a security briefing. The latest reforms had sparked particularly violent reactions from extremist groups. His home address had been posted online, accompanied by calls for traditional Americans to take action. Tom's therapy sessions intensified as he delved deeper into his past. Dr. Martinez helped him connect his childhood trauma, an absent mother, an abusive father, to his adult behaviors. "Understanding doesn't excuse," she reminded him, "but it helps us change." Tom began journaling, documenting instances where his prejudices had influenced his policing. One afternoon, he visited the cemetery where his father was buried. Standing at the grave, Tom spoke aloud the words he'd been practicing. "You were wrong, Dad, about everything." The admission felt like breaking chains that had bound him for decades. Samuel's reform movement gained unexpected allies. Several police chiefs publicly endorsed his proposals, arguing that better trained, more accountable officers meant safer communities for everyone. But these endorsements came with professional costs. One chief was forced to resign after facing backlash from his department. "Change comes at a price," Samuel reminded his supporters during a particularly difficult meeting. "But maintaining the status quo costs even more." The photos of victims that lined his office walls, including his son Marcus, testified to the truth of those words. The community center gymnasium had been transformed into a forum for truth-telling. Rows of chairs faced a small stage where Samuel Johnson sat alongside other community leaders, listening as people stepped forward to share their experiences with police brutality. The stories flowed like a river of pain. Mothers who'd lost children, professionals humiliated during routine traffic stops, young people forever changed by violent encounters. "My name is Angela Martinez," a middle-aged woman began, her voice trembling. "2 years ago, my son was killed during a wellness check. He was having a mental health crisis, and instead of getting help, he got 5 bullets." The room fell silent as she described how the system had failed her family at every turn. From the initial response to the subsequent investigation that cleared all officers involved. Samuel took detailed notes during each testimony, building a comprehensive record of systemic failures. These stories would become ammunition in the fight for reform, each one representing a crack in the foundation of a broken system. But more than that, they validated his own experience, proving that his assault wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern. Across town, Tom Brady thrashed in his bed, caught in the grip of a recurring nightmare. In his dream, he was simultaneously his adult self and the scared child who'd watched his father terrorize their neighbors. The faces of people he'd harassed, arrested, or abused over his career merged with memories of his father's victims. He woke up sweating, the ghost of his father's voice echoing in his head. "You keep them in line, boy. That's what makes you a man." The words that once guided his actions now made him physically ill. Tom stumbled to the bathroom, barely making it to the toilet before vomiting. Dr. Martinez had warned him about this phase of therapy, when suppressed memories and emotions would surface with devastating force. "Your psyche is processing years of trauma," she'd explained, "both what you experienced and what you inflicted on others." Tom spent the rest of the night writing in his journal, documenting every instance he could remember where he'd abused his authority. At the community forum, Samuel called for others who had suffered injustice to come forward. "Your stories matter," he declared. "Each voice adds strength to our demand for change." The response was overwhelming. People lined up for hours, some traveling from other states for the chance to be heard. A young officer, recently resigned from a nearby precinct, approached the microphone. "I lasted 8 months on the force," she said. "I reported excessive force used by my partner. The next day, my backup was mysteriously delayed during a dangerous call." Her testimony highlighted how the system punished those who tried to reform it from within. Tom watched recordings of these testimonies on his laptop, each story hitting him like a physical blow. He recognized himself in the officers being described: the casual cruelty, the unquestioned authority, the belief that their actions were justified. His therapy sessions became more intense as he worked through his role in perpetuating the cycle of violence. Samuel concluded the forum with a powerful call to action. "We're building more than a movement," he announced. "We're creating a record that cannot be ignored or denied. Every story shared here becomes part of our collective demand for justice." The crowd responded with a standing ovation, but Samuel noticed the empty threats he'd received that morning weighing heavy in his pocket. The National Convention Center buzzed with anticipation as thousands gathered for what media outlets had dubbed the Justice Summit. Samuel Johnson's movement had grown beyond anyone's expectations, attracting civil rights leaders, reform-minded police officials, and politicians from across the political spectrum. Security was tight, with both uniformed and plainclothes officers scanning the crowd for potential threats. Backstage, Samuel reviewed his speech one final time. The event would be broadcast live across all major networks, and his words needed to strike the perfect balance between urgency and hope. Sarah adjusted his tie, her hands trembling slightly. The death threats had increased in recent weeks, becoming more specific and credible. "We've identified several extremist groups planning to disrupt the event," his security chief reported. "But we're more concerned about lone actors." The words hung heavy in the air, everyone remembering the assassinations that had silenced other civil rights leaders throughout history. Meanwhile, Tom Brady faced his own crucible. The police department's internal investigation had concluded, recommending his termination. Social media had branded him the face of police brutality, his assault on Samuel playing endlessly on news channels. Some fellow officers considered him a traitor for his recent public statements, acknowledging systemic racism in law enforcement. "Your story matters too, Tom," Dr. Martinez had told him during their latest session. "Your journey from perpetrator to penitent could help others confront their own biases." Tom had begun speaking at police training sessions, sharing his path from inherited racism to painful self-awareness. Some officers walked out in protest, but others stayed, recognizing their own struggles in his words. Samuel took the stage to thunderous applause. Screens behind him displayed a powerful montage, historical civil rights protests alongside contemporary demonstrations, showing how the struggle for justice continued across generations. His speech wove together themes of accountability, transformation, and hope. "We stand at a crossroads," Samuel declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast hall. "The path forward requires courage, not just from those demanding change, but from those who must change." He outlined new legislation being introduced in Congress, training reforms being implemented in progressive departments, and community oversight programs showing promising results. Tom watched the speech from his apartment, every word resonating with his ongoing journey of redemption. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from other officers struggling with their own revelations about systemic racism. He'd become an unexpected bridge between the old guard and the reform movement. The atmosphere grew tense when counter-protesters began gathering outside the convention center. They carried signs defending traditional policing and denouncing Samuel as an enemy of law enforcement. Some wore tactical gear and displayed weapons, testing the limits of open carry laws. Inside, Samuel concluded his speech by addressing the opposition directly. "Fear of change is natural, but fear cannot justify injustice. We're not attacking police. We're transforming policing into what it always should have been, a service to all communities, regardless of color or creed." As he left the stage, multiple news outlets reported that extremist groups were calling for direct action against the movement. Samuel's security team rushed to adjust their protocols, knowing that the real test of their commitment to peaceful change might still lie ahead. The autumn air crackled with tension as Samuel led another peaceful demonstration outside City Hall. Unlike previous protests, this one carried a weight of imminent danger. Intelligence reports had warned of armed counter-protesters planning to disrupt the event, but Samuel refused to be silenced by threats. Thousands of supporters filled the plaza, their signs and voices united in calls for reform. Security teams positioned themselves strategically throughout the crowd, communicating through earpieces about suspicious movements. Sarah watched from nearby, her heart racing every time she lost sight of her father in the sea of people. The first sign of trouble came when a group of masked individuals began pushing through the crowd's outer edges. They carried crude weapons poorly concealed under jackets, their intentions clear in their aggressive movements. The police presence, already thin due to department politics, seemed to withdraw further as tension mounted. Tom Brady, watching the live coverage from his apartment, recognized the tactics being employed by the agitators. He'd seen similar scenarios play out before, usually ending in violence that would be blamed on the peaceful protesters. Without fully processing his decision, he grabbed his keys and headed for his car. "We will not be moved by intimidation," Samuel declared through the megaphone, even as his security team urged him to end the demonstration. Our right to peaceful protest is protected by the very Constitution I've spent my career defending." His words carried across the plaza, but so did the growing sounds of confrontation from the crowd's edges. The situation deteriorated rapidly. The counter-protesters began throwing objects into the crowd, creating chaos that rippled through the gathered masses. Samuel's security team tried to form a protective barrier around him, but the surging crowd made it difficult to maintain position. Tom arrived at the scene, his former police training helping him assess the situation quickly. He spotted several familiar faces among the agitators, former colleagues who'd been dismissed for misconduct. Their presence confirmed his worst fears about the nature of the threat. Without his badge or uniform, Tom pushed through the crowd toward Samuel. He arrived just as one of the masked agitators broke through the security line, wielding a metal pipe. Time seemed to slow as Tom recognized the moment for what it was, a chance for redemption or final damnation. "Judge Johnson, get down!" Tom's voice carried over the chaos as he positioned himself between Samuel and the attacker. The pipe descended, catching Tom across the shoulder instead of striking Samuel's head. The pain was immediate and intense, but Tom maintained his protective stance. The crowd's reaction was instant and documented by hundreds of phones. The man who had once been vilified for attacking the judge was now putting his body on the line to protect him. The imagery was powerful, a former aggressor transformed into a defender. Security teams and police finally converged on the scene, subduing the immediate threats. Samuel, despite his team's protests, moved to help Tom, who was now sitting on the ground clutching his injured shoulder. Their eyes met in a moment of profound recognition. Two men whose lives had become inextricably linked by violence, now connected by protection. The aftermath of the attempted attack transformed both men's stories in unexpected ways. Hospital corridors buzzed with activity as Tom received treatment for his injuries, including a fractured shoulder and several cracked ribs. Outside his room, media crews camped out, eager to document this dramatic turn in the narrative. Samuel sat in the hospital waiting room, wrestling with conflicting emotions. The man who had once brutally attacked him had now saved his life, complicating his understanding of justice and redemption. Sarah watched her father carefully, recognizing the familiar expression he wore when contemplating a particularly challenging legal decision. "The charges against Mr. Brady need to be reviewed," Samuel announced to his legal team, who had gathered in the hospital's conference room. "His actions today don't erase his past crimes, but they demonstrate the kind of transformation our movement advocates for." The discussion that followed was intense, with some arguing that leniency would undermine their message of accountability. In his hospital bed, Tom faced his own reckoning. His phone contained hundreds of messages, death threats from former colleagues who saw him as a traitor, and surprisingly, messages of support from reform advocates who recognized the courage it took to change. Dr. Martinez visited, helping him process the events and their implications for his ongoing journey. The press conference that followed became a defining moment in the reform movement. Samuel stood at the podium, his presence commanding as ever. "Today we witness the possibility of real change," he began. "Officer Brady's transformation from aggressor to protector embodies the very principles we're fighting for, that people can change when they confront their biases and choose a different path." Legal proceedings began to take a new shape. Samuel's testimony about Tom's intervention carried significant weight. While accountability remained essential, the focus shifted to rehabilitation and reform rather than pure punishment. The case became a template for how the justice system might better balance accountability with redemption. Tom's recovery period became an unexpected opportunity for dialogue. He and Samuel began meeting regularly, their conversations evolving from cautious exchanges to deep discussions about systemic racism, personal responsibility, and the possibility of change. These dialogues were recorded and incorporated into new police training programs. "Your story," Samuel told Tom during one such meeting, "proves that the cycle of violence and prejudice can be broken. But it requires courage to face uncomfortable truths." Tom nodded, understanding that his journey was far from over. He had begun working with police reform advocates, sharing his experiences to help other officers recognize and confront their own biases. The movement itself evolved, incorporating lessons from this unexpected alliance. Samuel's speeches now included powerful testimonials about transformation and redemption, alongside calls for accountability. The narrative became more nuanced, acknowledging that sustainable change required both justice and understanding. In the final scene, 1 year later, Samuel and Tom stood together at a police academy graduation ceremony. The new training protocols they'd helped develop were now standard procedure. As they watched the diverse group of graduates take their oaths, both men recognized that their personal story had become part of something larger, a blueprint for how individuals and institutions could face their flaws and emerge stronger. "The work continues," Samuel concluded in his graduation speech, "but now we know change is possible, not just in our systems, but in our hearts." Tom, standing at the back of the auditorium, touched his healed shoulder and nodded, understanding that their shared journey had only begun.